I remember the laughter first, that thin, brittle laughter that always sounds like glass being handled too quickly, the kind people use when they want to seem kind, but can't quite hide the pleasure of cruelty. They laughed when I sat alone at the wedding, all dressed in a dark blue gown that wasn't meant for joy but for respect, hands folded on my lap like a schoolgirl told to wait her turn. They laughed softly, but I heard them, the whispers, the small bursts of giggles behind manicured hands, the nervous glances toward the bride and groom as if my solitude might spread, as if sitting beside me would invite some contagious misfortune. I sat through it because I had promised myself I would not leave before the vows. I would not ruin Lucia's day, not after all these years of trying to be small enough to fit into her world, neat enough to blend with her polished life. My name wasn't on the family seating chart. The usher hesitated before placing me near the exit. He said it kindly. "We thought you'd prefer a little space." And I nodded because it was easier than explaining that space was all I'd ever been given lately. I didn't cry then. I don't cry in public anymore. I simply watched the petals scattered by children I didn't recognize, watched my own granddaughter glide down the aisle on her father's arm, the same man who once used to ask for my advice on everything, from suits to sermons. And when the priest lifted his eyes over the crowd and saw me, I saw his expression change. That's when I realized someone still remembered me, not as a guest, not as a burden, but by name, by history, by something earned. He had baptized Lucia 40 years ago. He had seen me younger, fuller, when my husband was still alive, and my laughter didn't need to apologize for itself. I hadn't expected him to still remember. Yet when he said her name, Lucia Maria Gutierrez, and then softly, almost reverently, said mine, Estela Rosa, I felt my whole spine realign. It was such a simple thing, a priest saying my name aloud, but it sounded like a correction to the universe. Around me, the guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing as if trying to recall where they'd heard that name before, as though it were an echo from another century. No one turned fully toward me, but the laughter stopped. It was the kind of silence that hums with embarrassment, that uneasy awareness of having misread the moment. I could have left then, made it dramatic, let my heels click on the marble floor, and given them something to gossip about for years. But I stayed. I've learned that absence is the only protest that leaves a mark. They can mock you when you're present, but when you vanish with quiet dignity, they must invent explanations, and those inventions are never kind to them. So I sat and thought of the years that had led me there, the invitations I didn't receive, the calls that stopped without being officially canceled, the way Lucia's voice on the phone had become formal, efficient, like customer service. "We're fine, Mama, just busy," she would say, as though affection were an outdated currency she no longer traded in. I blamed myself for a long time. Too strict when she was young, too frugal when she wanted things we couldn't afford, too outspoken when she married that man. I thought if I softened, if I agreed with her more, she'd let me back into her circle. But the circles of youth and vanity close tight. They don't reopen for the mothers who remind them of gravity and endings. I never expected warmth, but I expected decency, a seat among the living. And yet, at that wedding, surrounded by flowers and music, I realized I had been gently erased, not with malice, but with strategy. You see, cruelty among family rarely wears fangs. It wears perfume and speaks in perfect grammar. The music swelled. The bride's veil trembled like a wing caught in wind. The groom's mother dabbed her eyes theatrically, making sure the photographer caught it. I sipped the warm champagne left at my chair, a symbolic drink, flat, forgotten, but technically there, Every detail had been curated for beauty: ivory candles, crystal vases, strings of white orchids. But beauty without kindness is just decoration for emptiness. I watched Lucia exchange vows with a steadiness that once belonged to me. When she said "I do," her voice didn't waver. When she looked into her husband's eyes, there was no hesitation, no shadow of doubt. It struck me, oddly, that she'd learned that composure from me. I taught her how to keep her face still when she wanted to cry, how to make grace out of disappointment. I wondered if she knew she was performing my lessons while pretending I had never existed. When the ceremony ended, people clapped. I clapped too, though slower. The guests began moving toward the garden where tables waited, each with name cards printed in elegant cursive. I found mine, or rather, I found it missing. No card. Just an empty seat near the back, beside a decorative fountain that splashed politely to cover the noise of isolation. I sat there because I knew if I moved, someone would have to deal with me, and no one wanted that. They preferred the problem contained, seated neatly like part of the scenery. The laughter started again, softer this time, but sharper because it came from familiarity. I recognized some of them, old friends of Lucia's from university, women who had eaten at my table when they were broke, women I had driven home in the rain because buses stopped early. They smiled without recognition, and I understood that social amnesia is the first luxury of the privileged. A young server, barely 20, approached and asked if I wanted sparkling or still water. His kindness undid me a little. "Still," I said, "and thank you for asking." He poured it carefully, like he knew he was participating in a fragile ritual. He reminded me of my husband, Raoul, when he was young, attentive, nervous, aware of other people's feelings. I wished he could have seen this day, not because it was joyful, but because he'd always said, "One day you'll see who really sees you." I thought about that as I listened to Lucia give her speech. She thanked her in-laws for their generosity, her father's family for traveling, her friends who are like mothers. I laughed quietly at that. Like mothers. I had been the real thing, bloody, sleepless, faithful, but at that table, I was just a silhouette. I reached for my purse to find the small handkerchief I always carry. It's embroidered with Lucia's initials from her first school project. The thread is fading, but it's proof. I pressed it to my lips and waited for the moment to pass. That's when the priest, seated at the next table, turned toward me. He wasn't laughing. He raised his glass, not high, just enough for me to see, and mouthed the words, "You are seen." I nodded, and something inside me settled, not healed, but settled, like dust after a long storm. I finished my drink, stood for a moment, and felt every gaze flicker away. People pretending not to notice the woman they'd all collectively edited out of the frame. It would have been easier to leave quietly, but I've spent a lifetime doing what's easy for others. So I stayed until the music faded, until the lights dimmed, until the young people began taking selfies under the fairy lights. And then I did what no one expected. I went up to the priest and thanked him. He smiled the way people smile when they remember a different version of you, the one they thought was gone. "Estela Rosa," he said again, like it was a benediction. "You carried them here, whether they know it or not." His words were gentle, but they cracked something open. "Then I suppose I've delivered them," I said. "They can walk on their own now." He nodded, understanding what I meant and what I didn't. I turned toward the exit, my shoes clicking on the tiles, the sound too sharp for the music now playing. As I walked past the rows of people I once fed, taught, comforted, I realized they weren't mocking me because they hated me. They were mocking me because I reminded them of what time does to everyone. The laughter wasn't about me at all. It was their defense against the truth that one day they too will sit alone, waiting for someone to say their name with tenderness. Outside, the air was cool, the night steady and kind. I didn't wait for a car. I walked to the end of the driveway, past the line of rented lights and floral arches, past the smell of roses and champagne, until I reached the quiet of the road where no music followed. I stood there for a long moment, letting the sounds of celebration fade behind me. Somewhere, someone was still laughing, but in the hush that followed, I heard something far softer, the sound of my own pulse reminding me that I was still alive, still capable of being more than someone's forgotten guest. And when I finally whispered my own name, it didn't sound small, it sounded true. I did not know it at the moment the music shifted from the organ to the string quartet, and the guests were shepherded like glossy birds toward the reception lawn. But the small thing that would split the day open had already been arranged in a whisper I was never meant to hear, and it began to show itself in the shape of the path they laid for me, a path of velvet ropes no one needed because everyone already knew where I was not supposed to stand. So when I rose from my chair and followed, at the polite pace of a woman who understands that her presence is a favor to the room, the usher, with the hushed voice and the trained smile, stepped in front of me with a gesture that pretended to be helpful and said the family would be taking photographs in the rose pergola and that I would be more comfortable if I waited near the fountain where there was shade, which would have been thoughtful if shade were what I lacked rather than acknowledgement. And I thanked him anyway because old habits are obedient even when the soul is not. Then turned my face toward the wind so my expression would be scrubbed clean before anyone read it and decided it meant something inconvenient. I found the fountain they had chosen as my companion and sat on the low stone rim with my hands nested together, the way I used to hold Lucia's feet when she was a baby and would not sleep. And I watched the bright choreography of bodies clicking into frames under the photographer's command, the tidy architecture of belonging arranged with the efficiency of someone who has learned that families want proof more than truth. And perhaps I would have stayed there forever if not for the slip-in, the air that carried 2 sentences I will hear until I am done hearing anything at all. The coordinator in black with her clipboard leaned toward the photographer and said, almost kindly, "The mother is not to be included in any family set. The bride requested a clean tree, and the photographer, who was young enough to still trust instructions that arrived dressed as kindness, nodded without understanding the botany of erasure and answered, of course, as if he were agreeing not to overwater the centerpieces. I did not move then because shock in old women is a private room, a long corridor you walk through without making a sound. But something in me did tilt, the way a framed picture lists on a nail when the house settles after a storm, not broken yet, not even fallen, but off-center forever, and I let the water speak its slow language beside me until my breath found a rhythm that did not betray me. It would have been enough to hear it, that instruction delivered like a dietary restriction. But the world often wants to be thorough when it is excising you. So a moment later, the photographer raised his lens toward the bridesmaids, and then toward the groom's parents, and finally toward the cluster that should have been mine, the little hill of faces that look like you, whether they admit it or not. And he saw me at the edge of his frame, not in the way artists see, but in the way a person sees, a chair that should be moved 2 inches to the left. And he came over with all the gentle professionalism he could summon, and said he had a separate set for friends of the family, which is a phrase made of sugar and vinegar. And I smiled because even now I will not give them the picture of the woman whose mouth twists. And I said I was fine exactly where I was, meaning I was unwilling to be carried 1 inch further into the fiction. But he insisted the way kind men insist when their kindness is a job, and so I stood and walked with him to the lip of the pergola where Lucia stood radiant and distant. And I watched her lift her face to the camera with the same chin I had once cupped in my palm while pulling a splinter. And in that small, unfair second, I loved her with the kind of love that does not negotiate with insult. And then I witnessed something smaller and sharper, the way she did not look at me, not even as an accidental sweep, not even as a stray acknowledgement of a familiar shape, and the way her new husband, a man who collects status like cufflinks, placed his hand at her back as a promise to keep her from sinking into any past that could stain the present. And I understood the plan was not improvisation at all, but a choreography rehearsed somewhere I was not invited, perhaps over emails with bullet points, perhaps during tastings of cakes I paid for and never sampled, a choreography whose first movement was the elegant deletion of the one who would not match the table settings. If the moment ended there, it would still qualify as a hinge, but the day had decided to turn fully, and it did so when the priest, who had finished his blessing and had returned to the shade where practical men of God keep their soft eyes, approached the photographer and asked quietly if the bride's mother would like to stand nearer the center, because light loves a face that has earned it. And before the photographer could shape an answer, the coordinator pressed forward, strong with purpose, and said, "Father, the family has indicated there are sensitivities. We are honoring the bride's wishes." And the priest who had baptized Lucia with water, I warmed in my hands while dressing her in a little cotton gown that I hemmed with sleep in my eyes, looked from the coordinator to me and back again. And then he said my name out loud, not to challenge, not to provoke, but to ground the earth for one beat, and the way he said it, Estella Rosa, was the way people say a prayer when they are not sure they still believe, and he inclined his head to me as if receiving a confession. And that was when the sturdy thing in my chest settled into place like a locked latch, because it is one kind of loneliness to be ignored by your child, and another kind entirely to be notarized as invisible by a witness with a clipboard. I took a breath that belonged completely to me, and I made a decision I did not announce. From that instant on, I would not fight for corners at tables that had been set to exclude me. I would not barter my history for a place card. I would not explain myself into a space that prefers my absence, and I would not use my silence as a gift to people who confuse cruelty with curation. Decisions need rituals to keep them from evaporating, so I reached into my purse and pulled out a pen and the small wedding program printed on thick paper that pretends at permanence, and on the back where there was a white field waiting for nothing. In particular, I wrote one long sentence because I no longer have patience for bullets. A sentence that said that the women who carried the weight of a family across a desert of years are often seated near fountains, so the sound will cover the noise of their hearts, and that I was done lending my invisibility to anyone else's comfort, and that if God was listening, he could use my name as often as he liked, because I would be taking it back into my mouth every morning. And when I finished, I folded the paper like a small bird and slipped it into the pocket of my dress. And then I stood and walked toward the edge of the lawn where the roses bowed their heavy heads, and the air was not supervised, and I let the next song begin without me. The priest, who understood more than he would ever say in front of a microphone, met me there by accident or by mercy, and he asked if I needed water, which is what men offer when they want to give you something you can accept without owing them, and I said I did, and he handed me a glass he had lifted from a tray, and for a moment we were two parishioners taking a pause from a festival that claimed us and did not, and he told me gently that he had a ledger in his office from the year Lucia was born with my donation, noted in careful ink, the one that helped replace the leaking roof of the church after the storm, and that sometimes the roofs we repair are not the ones that shelter us later, and that this is not proof of injustice as much as a map of how love travels and gets lost, and that if I felt that map had led me to a dead end today, I should remember that roads are renamed by those who walk them long enough. And ordinarily I would have told him not to worry, that I was fine, that I had endured worse in rooms with less music, but I did not minimize what needed naming. So I said I heard the coordinator, and I said I understood precisely, and I said I would not be returning to the receiving line to pretend this was an oversight. And the relief that crossed his face was a small mercy, because good men fear the fury of women who have swallowed a lifetime of disrespect. And mine was not a fury. It was a conclusion. When I returned to the fountain, I did not sit. I remained standing because people believe standing women are still part of the event, while seated women become furniture, and I wanted them to know I was neither. I was a witness whose testimony would be given elsewhere, in the court of my own kitchen, in the sanctuary of my evening chair, where decisions harden into plans. And in that alert stillness, a boy with a tray passed by and offered me a canapé I did not want. And then he whispered, without looking at me, that he had seen the bride stop the photographer's assistant when I drifted too near the group, and that he was sorry because his own grandmother lived with his family, and sometimes his mother sighed as if she were tired of her, and I told him that what mattered was how he stood in a room when women grew inconvenient, and he nodded like he had been handed a key he didn't yet recognize, and he walked away taller, and that was the first breath of the new weather inside me, the one that gathers after drought and says that clouds can be instructions rather than threats. By the time the cake was presented and the knives were lifted for the ceremonial slicing of sugar that always pretends to be sweetness, I had learned everything I needed to learn, which is that I would not beg to be included in a photograph that my own eyes would not respect. I would not contribute the mimicry of blessing to a partnership that began with the formal exclusion of the woman who taught one of its members to hold a fork, and I would not take home a favor wrapped in ribbon that would sit accusingly on a dresser I dusted alone. Instead, I would carry home the program with my sentence and the name the priest had released into the air like a bell, and I would place both where I could see them until they grew roots. That was the catalyst, not a scream or a scene, but a sentence overheard, and a ledger remembered, and a face that refused to turn toward me. And from that quiet collision came the only vow I made that day, a vow to stop auditioning for rooms I helped build, and the moment I made it, the laughter around me lost its glassy sparkle and became what it always was, a noise people make when they are afraid they will one day need what they are throwing away. The night after the wedding did not end when the music stopped. It only changed its rhythm, like a wound learning how to pulse on its own. And as the laughter and applause drained from the garden and the caterers began stacking glasses into dull pyramids of exhaustion, I stayed in my seat by the fountain long enough for the moon to take the place of the chandelier light, because leaving too early would have made me look offended, and leaving too late would have made me look lost. And both were roles I had already played too many times to audition again. I watched them through the open doors of the reception hall. Lucia radiant and restless, dancing without joy but with precision, a woman who understood that a performance must never collapse before its witnesses. Her husband twirled her with the confidence of a man who believes the room belongs to him, and perhaps it did. The family, the decor, the air itself seemed to bend toward their new alignment. I was a shadow stitched to the edge of it all, a figure that blended too easily with the drapery. When the priest left, he touched my shoulder briefly, a gesture half blessing, half apology, and said he hoped I would get home safely. He did not say goodbye. No one ever does when they are afraid the farewell might sound permanent. When I finally called a car, the young driver looked confused by the address on his screen. "You came from there?" he asked, glancing at the illuminated tent behind us. "It's the big one, right? The fancy one." I smiled and said yes, though the word fancy felt like a splinter. During the ride, I watched the reflections of headlights slide across the window, streaks of borrowed light cutting through the black, and I thought of how easy it is for a person to disappear without leaving a mark, how whole generations of women have been folded into family histories as supporting characters whose names fade from the record once their usefulness expires. At home, I removed the bobby pins from my hair one by one, each tiny click sounding like punctuation in a letter I had not yet written. My dress still smelled of roses and champagne, but underneath was another scent, iron and dust, the smell of something closing. I hung the dress in the narrow closet, where my husband's coat still lingered like ghosts of civility. They had kept their shape longer than the promises we made to each other, which, I suppose, is what fabric does when no one touches it. The following days settled into the strange quiet that comes after a public humiliation. It is not quite peace, not quite pain, but a dense in-between, where the mind replayed scenes with forensic obsession, looking for the moment when dignity might have been saved, or at least hidden. I told myself that Lucia would call, that perhaps she would explain the seating or the photographs, that some miscommunication would be confessed in the tone of an apology. But the phone stayed still on the table, glowing occasionally with advertisements or reminders, never with her name. On the third morning, a thick white envelope arrived by courier, a leftover courtesy from the wedding planner. Inside was a printed photograph of the bridal party. Everyone was there, the groom's family, the bridesmaids, even the florist who had arranged the arch. I looked carefully, line by line, face by face. There was no trace of me, not even in the blurred background, as though the camera had been coached to erase me frame by frame. It was not an accident. It was the perfection of intent. I slipped the photo back into the envelope and tucked it under a stack of unpaid bills. Some silences deserved to be buried with their evidence. The small town I lived in had always been mercilessly observant. At the market, the cashier asked how beautiful the wedding must have been, and I said yes, it was perfect, because truth has no currency among acquaintances who want small talk, not confession. A neighbor left a bouquet on my porch with a note that read, "Congratulations to the family." I left it there until the petals fell inward, curling into themselves like secrets. When I tried to walk to the post office a few days later, I saw one of Lucia's friends from school, the kind of woman who calls everyone dear while measuring their clothes with her eyes, and she hugged me too tightly, whispering, "You must be so proud." The word proud clanged inside me like a spoon against a cracked glass. Pride had been the first thing I'd been asked to surrender when Lucia grew into her own version of refinement. She had once said, "You don't have to mention you worked in the textile factory anymore, Mom. People will think we came from nothing." I remember laughing then, though it wasn't funny, and telling her that coming from nothing had been the most honest part of my life. Now I understood she had meant it as a rehearsal for this day, for the art of invisibility perfected. By the end of the week, I began to notice how the world subtly adjusted to my reduced volume. Calls from cousins slowed, invitations to church committees evaporated, and even the postman, who used to linger for gossip, began to nod from a polite distance as though grief might be catching. I cleaned the house with a furious precision, scrubbing corners that hadn't mattered in years. The more I cleaned, the smaller I felt. The act of wiping surfaces became a translation of thought. Erase, erase, erase. When night came, I would sit by the window and watch the lights from the hill where the wedding had been, faint golden dots like echoes of laughter that refused to die. Sometimes I wondered if I had imagined the cruelty, if perhaps I had misunderstood their careful exclusions, but then I would open my purse and find the folded program with my own handwriting, the sentence about the women near fountains, and it would steady me like an anchor. No, I had not imagined it. You cannot mishear your own name being avoided. About a week later, Lucia finally called. Her voice was brisk, too high, the tone of someone trying to repair a broken vase by describing its former beauty. She said she hoped I had enjoyed myself, that everything had been so hectic, and that they had missed me at brunch the next morning. I told her I hadn't been invited. There was a pause, the kind that reveals more than it conceals. "Oh, I'm sure it was just an oversight," she said, and then asked if I had seen the photographs. I said I had, and that they were lovely, which was true in the way professionally staged lies are always lovely. Before hanging up, she added, "You looked elegant in your dress, Mama. Maybe a bit somber, but elegant." I almost thanked her, but the word caught in my throat like a fishbone. After the call, I placed the phone on the table and stared at it until the screen went dark. I realized then that waiting for decency from the people who taught you humiliation is a kind of madness disguised as hope. Autumn crept in quietly after that, rearranging the color of the sky and making the evenings longer, which I found oddly comforting. The slower light gave me time to think. I began walking in the evenings, down the narrow streets where the lamplight touched the walls like old hands. I passed houses where families ate together, laughter muffled behind curtains, and I wondered if every family had a ghost seated at its edges, someone they chose to forget, but who still watched over them from a polite distance. Sometimes I stopped by the church, not to pray, but to sit on the cool steps and listen to the echo of my own footsteps. One evening, the priest came out and found me there. He said he had been thinking of the wedding, of how strange it felt to see so many smiles that did not reach their eyes. He told me I should come to the Sunday service. I told him maybe, though we both knew I wouldn't. Faith, like family, is hard to visit when you've been told there's no room left inside. The days grew shorter, and so did my patience for pretending. I started sorting through old boxes, shredding documents that no longer meant anything. Insurance papers from Raoul's job, Lucia's school reports, a pile of postcards she'd sent me in her 20s, full of exclamation points and affection. I kept only one, the one where she had written, "Don't ever change, Mama, you're my anchor." I read it again and again until the words seemed written by a stranger. Change, it turned out, was not a choice. It was the tax you pay for staying alive after people decide you are no longer required. I found an old sewing kit and repaired the hem of the dress I had worn to the wedding, not because I planned to wear it again, but because I wanted to leave nothing undone. As I pushed the needle through the dark fabric, I thought about how women like me are expected to mend everything: clothes, tempers, silences, and how sometimes the only rebellion left is to stop fixing what others break. By November, I had stopped waiting entirely. The world had continued without me, as worlds do. But I noticed something unexpected in the quiet, a small pulse of peace, the kind that hums underneath despair when it finally exhausts itself. I still visited the market, still nodded to the neighbor, still baked bread on Sundays. But these acts no longer felt like proof of participation. They were simply mine. I began to write notes to myself on scraps of paper, reminders of what was real. "You were there," one said. "You saw what they did." Another read, "They laughed because they were afraid." These small affirmations were not defiance, but preservation. Every time I read them, I felt less like a ghost and more like a survivor cataloging the ruins for future pilgrims. The exclusion had not destroyed me. It had only stripped away the illusions that had made endurance feel like love. One cold morning, I went to the park and sat on a bench facing the pond. The trees were almost bare, and the wind carried the faint scent of frost. A group of teenagers were taking photos near the water, posing and laughing. For a moment, the sound startled me. It was so familiar, so like the laughter at the wedding. But then I realized it wasn't cruel. It was young, harmless, unaware. I smiled at that, because cruelty requires intention, and innocence is its own kind of mercy. As I rose to leave, I noticed the reflection of the sky in the pond, pale, cracked by ripples, and for the first time since that day, I did not see my isolation mirrored there. I saw possibility, a space widening rather than closing. The first escalation had done its work. The wound was clean now, and from it something living would have to grow, even if no one else was watching. The morning the change began did not announce itself with any grand revelation, no sudden epiphany, no letter or phone call, nothing that could later be named as the cause. It was only the faintest adjustment of the light coming through the window, a softened angle that made the dust motes visible in their quiet dance. And as I watched them move, I felt an unexpected tenderness toward their persistence. Those tiny fragments that refused to stay, settled even after being undisturbed for years. I made coffee slowly, the way one performs a ritual rather than a task. And when I sat down at the kitchen table, I realized it was the first time in months I had not imagined the chair opposite me filled by anyone else. The absence no longer demanded to be explained. I drank the bitter coffee without sugar and thought that perhaps my life had also reached its honest flavor at last. When you spend enough time in silence, you begin to hear your own breathing as an answer to questions no one will ever ask. That morning, I decided I would walk to town, not to run errands, not to see anyone in particular, but simply to test whether the world still recognized my outline. It was early autumn, the air clean and sharp, the streets still damp from the night's quiet rain. The first leaves were beginning to fall, their colors muted but steady, the kind of beauty that doesn't need witnesses to exist. I walked past the bakery where Lucia and I used to stop after her piano lessons, and I remembered her small hand in mine, sticky with sugar, her laughter spilling over the sidewalk as she insisted I buy an extra pastry for the bus driver. Those memories no longer hurt the way they once did. They had become something softer, like a bruise that has already turned yellow. I stopped by the window of the bakery and saw the same woman behind the counter, older, heavier, but still with the same impatient kindness in her face. When she noticed me, her eyes lit up for a moment before she placed her hand over her mouth. "Senora Gutierrez," she said, "it's been years. How are you?" Her voice carried no pity, only recognition, and that was enough to make my throat ache. I told her I was well, and before I knew it, I had bought a small loaf of bread I did not need, just to feel again the exchange of something warm across a counter. As she handed it to me, she said, "I always wondered what happened to your daughter." She was such a bright girl. I smiled without answering. The truth was too long for a conversation between loaves and change. Outside, I walked without direction until I reached the edge of the old district where the buildings leaned toward each other, as if in secret conversation. There was a sign in the window of a small community center. Volunteers needed for after-school reading club. The letters were crooked, hand-painted, the kind of imperfection that invites rather than excludes. I stood there for a long time staring at the sign, feeling the faint stirring of something I had thought extinct, the desire to be useful without being consumed. When you spend your life giving, you forget that giving can also be chosen. I entered the building before I could think myself out of it. Inside, a woman with short gray hair sat behind a desk cluttered with papers and mismatched mugs. She looked up with a smile that didn't need to prove anything. "You hear about the reading club?" she asked. I nodded. "Do you like children?" she continued. "I used to," I said, and then corrected myself. "I still do." She laughed softly. "Good enough. We meet Tuesdays and Thursdays. Can you read out loud?" "Yes," I said. "I used to be a teacher." She handed me a clipboard. "Then you're overqualified." The simplicity of it felt like a blessing disguised as bureaucracy. I wrote my name carefully on the form, the letters steady despite the tremor that sometimes visits my hands when I'm anxious. For a moment, I hesitated at the line that asked for emergency contact. I left it blank. Some blanks deserve to stay honest. When I returned home that afternoon, the house no longer felt like a waiting room. The light had shifted again, gentler now, as though acknowledging that something had been set in motion. I placed the loaf of bread on the counter and laughed to myself at the small absurdity of it. A woman who had been invisible for months, buying bread as if to celebrate her own reappearance. I sliced it and ate a piece with butter, the simplest communion, and it tasted better than anything I'd eaten at that wedding banquet, where the plates were perfect and the hearts were hollow. I thought of Lucia then, not with anger, but with a kind of detached affection, the way one thinks of a dream that once seemed like prophecy, but later revealed itself as only longing. I imagined her in her new life, busy, elegant, performing the rituals of success she'd always craved. Perhaps she, too, sometimes paused at a window, feeling a tug of memory she could not name. The thought didn't comfort me, but it didn't wound me either. It was simply part of the landscape of being alive. The first session at the reading club was chaotic, in the gentle way that only rooms full of children can be. There were crayons scattered on tables, mismatched chairs, the smell of dust and fruit juice. The coordinator introduced me as Miss Estella, and I saw a few of the children look at me with the cautious curiosity reserved for new adults who don't yet have authority over them. I began by reading a story about a bird who builds her nest in a storm, and halfway through, one of the girls interrupted me to say that birds don't read books. I told her she was right, but that some people don't either, and still managed to tell stories. That earned a few giggles. When the session ended, one of the boys, a quiet child with uneven shoelaces, asked if I would be coming back next week. "Yes," I said, surprising myself with how certain it sounded. On the way home, I caught my reflection in a shop window, my hair disheveled, my coat slightly frayed, and for the first time in years, I didn't flinch. The woman looking back at me wasn't the one left behind at the fountain. She was someone walking forward, not fast, but without permission. That evening, I took out a notebook I hadn't used since Raoul's death. Its pages yellowed, but still smelling faintly of cedar. I wrote the date, and beneath it, without planning, a single line: I am beginning again, quietly. It didn't feel like an announcement. It felt like a confession whispered to the air. The next morning, I woke before dawn and sat by the window watching the street lamps fade. The world, indifferent as it was, had given me another day, and I decided I would use it. I swept the porch, trimmed the withered plants, and when the mail arrived, I didn't dread opening it. There was nothing of importance inside, just bills, advertisements, an old magazine renewal. But I sorted them carefully, marveling at the simple satisfaction of small order. It occurred to me that renewal rarely arrives as grand rescue. More often, it hides in the dull repetition of ordinary acts until one day you realize they no longer feel like survival, but like living. Weeks passed in that slow, golden rhythm. The children at the club began greeting me with hugs, and one day, the shy boy brought me a drawing of a bird with enormous wings and said, "It's you." I laughed, though my eyes stung. The woman at the bakery began saving me a roll in the mornings. I bought a second-hand coat from the thrift shop, navy blue with deep pockets, practical and warm, and though I could almost hear Lucia's voice saying it looked too old-fashioned, I loved it instantly. It became my armor against the cold, my declaration of continued existence. When I wore it, people greeted me differently, as if the world could sense when someone has reclaimed her place in it. One afternoon, while leaving the community center, the priest passed by. He recognized me and stopped, his eyes bright. "You've been busy," he said, glancing at the flyers on the wall. "I hear you're saving souls through literature now." "Just keeping them company," I replied. He smiled. "Sometimes that's the same thing." We stood in the hallway, the sunlight pooling at our feet, and for a moment I felt something like gratitude. Not for him, not even for redemption, but for the fact that I had survived long enough to reach this calm. That night, as I prepared for bed, I opened the folded wedding program I still kept in my drawer. The ink had begun to fade, my handwriting softened into near illegibility, but the words were still there. I am done lending my invisibility to anyone else's comfort. I read it aloud, slowly, tasting each syllable. Then I added a second line beneath it. I have learned how to be seen without asking. I folded it again, placed it back in the drawer, and turned off the light. The house, which had once been too quiet, now hummed with a low, steady peace. I realized the shift was not in the house, but in me. I no longer needed witnesses to confirm my belonging. The midpoint of my story had arrived without ceremony. It was not a rescue or a return, but a reclamation. The subtle, steadfast decision to live as though I were already whole. The first sign that the past was not done with me came folded into an envelope that did not match the rest of the mail. Its paper heavier, its handwriting careful in the way people write when they want to be taken seriously. And when I slid it open, with the butter knife I keep in the drawer for this quiet violence, a smaller card slid into my palm. A photograph on one side of the newly married pair beneath the rose arch, and on the other, a printed note from a company that makes keepsakes for families who like their memories laminated, thanking me for my purchase and confirming that grandmother's copies had been sent to my address at the bride's request. I stood in my kitchen with the card between my fingers and knew immediately that I had not bought anything and that the gesture was not generosity, but choreography, an attempt to fold me back into the story as a grateful recipient of curated images, instead of the witness who had refused to stand where she was told. And when I turned the card back over to the photograph I saw, with a chill that was more clarity than shock, that in the wide shot where the rose arch framed everyone like an award, the camera had caught me after all, not in proximity to the family, not even in soft focus near the back, but reflected in the curved silver of the fountain's rim, a ghostly oval of dark blue and pressed hands. And I laughed aloud, because even when they edited me out, the world kept sneaking me back in through physics, through light, through the stubborn honesty of surfaces that mirror what stands before them, whether asked or not. I set the card down and made tea and told myself I would not be baited by such pretty provocations. But that afternoon, the phone rang, and the voice that reached me was a young woman's voice that cracked slightly on the first word and then steadied itself with the determination of someone who has practiced strength in a bathroom mirror. And she said, "Hello, abuela," in a rush that made me sit down. And I knew at once it was my grandson, the boy who had always stood slightly apart at family gatherings as if choosing his place instead of accepting the one assigned, the boy who used to hide near my chair with a book while the adults performed adulthood loudly around him. Only now he was not a boy, but a man with a job in another city and a way of speaking that tried to protect me from his worry. And he said he had learned about the seating and the photographs and the small politics of the day, because even the most curated families cannot help leaking, and he was sorry he had been sent to fetch ice during the portraits and had returned to find me gone from every frame and the air around his mother fragile as glass. And he wanted to know if I was all right, if I needed anything, if I had eaten, which made me laugh because nothing, says love, like the practical questions that keep the body alive while the heart scrapes its knees. I told him I was fine, that I was baking bread again, that the reading club children had discovered a story about a fox who outsmarts hunters by pretending to be asleep, and he exhaled hard as though he had been holding his breath for weeks. Then said there was something else, that his mother had asked him to convince me to come to a family discussion about the future, a phrase that clanged in the ear like polite thunder, and I told him I loved him too much to let him be a courier for threats dressed as meetings, and he was quiet a long time before he said he understood, and that he would come see me if I wanted, and that if I did not, he would wait until I did. And those three offers, come, wait, or leave me in peace, were the most respectful map of love anyone had offered me in years. It might have ended there, a tender call resealed with silence, but tests rarely come singly, and a few days later, a letter arrived, not in a heavy envelope, but from a heavy name, a law firm with a door that probably smells like leather and money, informing me in language so polished it squeaked that my daughter and her husband had expressed concern about my well-being and were exploring supportive arrangements, which was a phrase that could mean anything from a weekly grocery delivery to the quiet theft of a person's life through signatures and soft coercion, and that a social worker would be in touch to schedule a visit to assess capacity, as though the years I had carried them and my own grief were boxes to be counted and labeled in a stranger's handwriting. I felt my gorge rise, not with panic, but with the memory of 1,000 tiny patronages that had attempted to rename my competence as an inconvenience. And I placed the letter on the table beside the photograph of the fountain and the reflection of my stubborn presence, and I thought very calmly that even kindness has customs officers when it is routed through institutions. That afternoon, I went to the community center to read with the children, and I chose a story about a woman who keeps a key around her neck and refuses to explain to anyone what door it opens, and halfway through, the quiet boy with the uneven shoelaces raised his hand and asked, in a voice so soft it felt like a leaf brushing my cheek, whether people who love you can take your key if they say it's for your safety. I answered that sometimes, when people are afraid of their own decisions. They borrow the keys of others to lock away the things that remind them of their fear, and that safety can be a velvet rope or a wolf costume depending on who is using the word. And that the most important thing a person can learn is the difference between a warm hand and a firm grip, and the boy nodded as if I had returned to him something he did not realize had been stolen. By the end of that week, the whispers reached the parish in the way news always does when it is carried by women who fold it into their shopping lists. And after the Sunday service, the priest found me on the steps and said gently that he had been approached by Lucia, who told him in a voice full of concern that I had become withdrawn, that I was isolating, that I might be refusing help. And I laughed at the way the diagnosis had been assembled like a bouquet from the florist of appearances, a spray of words that smelled sweet and hid thorns. And I told him that I was reading to children and walking in the mornings and making soup for the neighbor who had broken her hip, that I was more present in my own days than I had been in years. And he put his hand over mine with the carefulness of a man who does not want to be accused of presumption, and said he believed me, but that families often seek allies in robes when they begin taking territory, and that I should be prepared for visits that pretend to be invitations, and for questions that pretend to be concern, and that I might want to write down what I wanted in the clearest language I could find, so that when the storm arrived, I would have my own weather report to consult. I went home and did exactly that. I sat at the kitchen table with a pen I had saved for signings that never happened, and wrote my name at the top of a page, and beneath it a list that began like a prayer and ended like a contract. I will remain in my home for as long as my mind knows my name. I will consent to help I choose and refuse help that demands obedience. I will talk to doctors who look me in the face and not to managers who talk through me. I will share meals with those who bring salt without judgment. I will leave my door unlocked to children who read and locked to adults who lecture. I will keep my key. The next pressure came not through paper, but through the air of the cafe, where I stopped sometimes after the reading club to borrow the hum of strangers, a little place with a counter that had absorbed more elbows than any altar. And as I sat with my cup, the door chimed, and in walked Lucia, not flamboyant, not angry, just perfectly assembled in a coat that knew how to swing like a curtain. And she looked around and spotted me, and performed surprise badly, then approached with a smile that trembled at one corner, and asked if she could sit. And I nodded because I am not afraid of chairs. She began with weather, then memory, then concern, and finally the thesis that had been prepared for her by someone who uses power as a salt that makes everything taste like permission. And she said she was only worried because I had been distant and that the family was ready to support me in planning for the next stage. And I said very quietly that my next stage was this stage, that I was not a theater with acts to be closed by applause I did not request. And she flinched as if the words had been physical, and she said I was being dramatic. And I said, drama is when people set scenes and hand out roles. And I declined the part of the grateful burden. And she said I had hurt the bride by leaving the reception early. And I said the bride had hurt herself by believing a photograph could hold a family together any better than kindness. And Lucia's eyes filled briefly before Discipline forced them back to dry, and she said she had asked a lawyer to help because she didn't know what else to do, and I said she could have asked me, and then we were silent. Two women sitting with different definitions of love, cooling between. Us like tea we had both forgotten to drink. When she left, she touched my shoulder, the same shoulder the priest had touched, but her hand was different, more like a stamp than a blessing, and once she was gone, I realized my entire body had been bracing against her visit like a house in a high wind, and that it had held. The visit from the social worker arrived a week later, announced by a cheerful call that offered 3 appointment slots as if it were a hair salon. And I declined them all with a politeness so firm the woman on the line faltered and asked if this was a bad time. And I said it was a free time, and I intended to keep it that way. And she recovered and said she would note my refusal, but that she might be required to come anyway, under a wellness check requested by family. And I thanked her and told her I would be home if she did, with the kettle on, and a neighbor present to witness the conversation, because women who are alone learn early that witnesses are the stitches that keep fabric from unraveling under rough hands. I called the neighbor afterward, the widow, 2 doors down, whose knees are bad, but whose hearing is excellent, and she said she would be honored to sit at my table and watch a stranger ask me to hand over my life, and we laughed, and then we went grocery shopping together because defiance works better on a full stomach. The social worker arrived with soft shoes and hard forms and sat at my table, touching everything with the hesitant reverence of someone entering a museum. And she asked me whether I paid my bills, whether I cooked, whether I felt safe, whether I knew the date, and I answered each question with the patience I had learned from years of explaining the obvious to people who are paid to pretend it is not. And when she asked me whether I had friends, I pointed to my neighbor, who raised her hand like a schoolgirl, and when she asked me whether I had purpose, I told her about the reading club and the boy with the bird drawing. And when she asked me about the wedding, her eyes flicked to the mantel where I had placed the fountain photograph, its silver arc catching a sliver of my dress, and I told her I had attended and that the priest had remembered my name and that it had been enough. And she nodded in a way that made me think she had a mother somewhere who collected small victories and kept them in jars labeled enough. She left with her forms half filled and her voice polite and careful, and I realized my hands were steady, that I had not once reached for the table for support, that my body believed me. The pressure did not stop. It shifted shape the way wind does when it learns the corners of a new house. A cousin called to tell me she had seen a social media post where Lucia thanked the village that had raised her and tagged 20 people whose kitchens I had never set foot in, and my name was not there, which would have meant nothing on any other week, but now it sat like a pearl of grit under the eyelid, and my cousin was outraged on my behalf, her anger hot and adolescent, and I thanked her and changed the subject because borrowed fires burned through the wrong roofs. The next Sunday, the parish bulletin announced a fundraiser for the roof again, time having chewed through the old repairs, and the priest made a gentle joke about the faithful few who had saved them once before. And after the service, Lucia approached. Him, in a gesture rehearsed for witnesses, pressing an envelope into his hand in front of the altar, and for a moment I considered walking over and matching it in amount and ceremony, and then I laughed at myself, because performance is a quicksand I have learned to recognize. So instead I went home and wrote a quiet check and mailed it without note, a private tithe to a building that keeps my name in a ledger, regardless of who reads it. That night, The widow with the good ears came over with soup and told me she had heard, through the grapevine that always bears fruit, that Lucia was planning a holiday event at which mothers would be asked to stand for a photograph with their daughters. And I said perhaps the photograph would turn out beautifully, and my neighbor said I was either a saint or a fool, and I told her I was neither, merely finished with the kind of heartbreak that bends itself into applause. Then, like a test arranged by a playwright who likes symmetry, I received an invitation on thick paper to a private conversation at Lucia's house, with the lawyer's business card tucked inside like a thorn hidden in a rose. And while once I would have dressed carefully and prepared my explanations, now I placed the card on the mantel and let it stare at the fountain reflection until it learned what a mirror is for, and I wrote a letter instead, not yet the formal letter that arrives like a Dr. Closing that would come soon enough, but a human letter addressed to my daughter in the voice she had known when she was small, telling her that I was not withdrawing, I was choosing, that I was not angry, I was awake, that I would meet her for coffee in a public place if she wanted to talk as equals, and that I would not attend any event where the guest list included my obedience as entertainment. And I mailed it and felt the house exhale as though it had been gripping the envelope with me. Days passed with the rain teaching the gutters to sing again, and in that weather the call from my grandson came back like a bird returning to a window it trusts. He said quietly that his mother was furious, that her version of love grows louder. The more frightened it becomes, that he had tried to explain that I was not disappearing, but standing where I could be seen cleanly, and that he would be in town soon for work and could meet me by the community center if I liked, and I told him I would. Bring the story about the fox, and we would see if he still believed in animals who play dead to survive. When he arrived, he was taller than the last photograph I had of him, and thinner too, worry carving elegant lines where youth had once pooled, and we walked slowly past the park, and he told me he had left the wedding early that night, not out of protest, but out of nausea, the kind that comes from inhaling too much perfume sprayed on rot. And he had gone to his apartment and sat on the floor and stared at his hands and thought about how a family can misplace its center without noticing. And I told him that centers do not disappear. They simply refuse to be used as coat racks. And he laughed and then cried and then apologized for both. And we sat on a bench and shared a pastry I had bought at the bakery and did not speak for a long time. And that silence, unlike the silences of the past year, was tender and full, the kind that grows moss and softens stones. Before he left, he took from his coat a photograph he had printed himself, not from the wedding, but from a morning years ago when he and I had been in the kitchen making pancakes, and he had snapped a picture on a cheap camera of my hands, turning a spoon, the blur of motion making it look as though I were painting with batter. And he said he kept it on his desk to remember that care is a verb. And I told him to keep it close, that verbs are the only proof we ever have that love existed at all. The next day, Lucia called again, her voice controlled, her words read from a script I could hear in the way the sentences did not breathe. And she said the lawyer had advised that if I refused reasonable measures, the family would be forced to consider options. And that phrase, so clean and so ugly, tested the new scaffolding I had been building inside myself. And I felt it sway and then settle. And I said very calmly that options are for menus and elections and not for mothers who have done nothing but live, and that I would send her my wishes in writing, and that any further conversation should come without witnesses in suits. And before she could respond, I wished her a good night with the sincerity of someone who means it, and hung up the phone and stood very still in the quiet kitchen and placed my hand over my heart and felt it keep time as if it had never been threatened at all. That evening I took out the notebook and wrote a second line beneath my quiet declaration: I will defend my life without becoming a soldier in anyone else's war. Then I turned down the lamp and sat a long time listening to the house, which at last sounded like a place where a woman lived who knew the difference between being tested and being taken, and I understood that the escalation had arrived, and I had not collapsed under it. I had become instead the kind of person the wind goes around. The decision came not as a roar, but as a stillness, a moment so calm it frightened me, because true resolve never arrives in noise. It slips into the room quietly, sits down at your table, and waits for you to notice that your breathing has changed. I was sitting by the window with the letter from Lucia's lawyer in front of me, the one that had tried to make concern sound like authority, and I found myself no longer angry, no longer even insulted. I was simply finished. The light outside was a pewter gray, the kind that flattens shadows into honesty. The trees were trembling with the first signs of winter, and I thought how they never apologize for shedding what they no longer need. I folded the letter carefully, not in rage, but with the precision of a seamstress closing a garment for the last time, and I placed it in the drawer beside the faded wedding program, the one with my vow to stop lending my invisibility to anyone else's comfort. The two papers lay together like before and after photographs of the same soul. That was when I knew what I had to do. There would be no arguments, no tears, no dramatic speeches about gratitude or betrayal. The end of a pattern is not a confrontation. It is an act of design. I spent the next few days preparing without entirely admitting it to myself. I cleaned the house from ceiling to floor, washed every curtain, polished the frames that held photographs of people who had already forgotten the moments they once posed for. I didn't remove them. I'm not vindictive, only exacting. The act of order was for me, not for them. I sorted papers into 3 piles: what I wanted to keep, what I wanted to burn, and what I would leave behind deliberately so there would be no mystery, no myth. Mysteries, I've learned, invite revision. Clarity denies resurrection. I wrote a short will in the notebook I had begun keeping months earlier, my handwriting slow but steady. I left the house to the community, the furniture to charity, the books to the Children's Reading Club, and the rest. Small jewelry, old letters, the wedding ring in its teacup, to whoever felt the need to search for relics. I didn't call anyone to announce these things. Announcements are for events that seek an audience. This was not that. This was a woman building the architecture of her own autonomy. On the 3rd day, I walked into town to the notary's office. The young clerk behind the counter was polite in the way people are when they sense age, but not weakness. She asked if I had an appointment. I told her I didn't need one for the truth. She smiled uncertainly and handed me a form. I filled it out in silence, my pen carving through the paper like a chisel. When the notary himself appeared, a man in a dark suit with tired eyes, I told him I wanted to sign a power of attorney, one that assigned every choice about my life and death to myself, explicitly, irrevocably, leaving no space for intervention, disguised as affection. He read it, adjusted his glasses, and said, "You understand this means no one can act for you if you are ill?" I said, "That's exactly why I'm here." He nodded, perhaps sensing something sacred in the bluntness, and when I placed my signature beneath the declaration, my hand didn't shake. The sound of the pen on paper was the sound of a lock clicking shut, not imprisoning, but sealing. I paid the small fee in cash, thanked him, and walked out into the thin winter sunlight, which suddenly felt like applause too dignified for noise. I stopped by the community center on my way home. The children were gone, but their drawings covered the wall in a riot of color. Birds, stars, mountains, trees that looked like explosions of joy. In the corner was one I recognized, the quiet boy's picture of a bird with enormous wings, the one he'd said was me. I stood in front of it for a long time. The woman who ran the program came out of her office and asked if everything was all right. I said yes. I just wanted to look. She said the children had been asking about me and that they missed my stories. I promised I'd be back next week, though I wasn't sure if that promise was to her or to myself. Before leaving, I pinned a small note beneath the drawing. Fly well. The sky is yours now. It wasn't a farewell, just a translation of faith. Back home, the phone was ringing. I knew the number. I let it ring until it stopped. The voicemail was Lucia's voice, rehearsed but cracking at the edges, saying she'd received my letter, that she didn't understand why I was being so final, that she wanted to come talk in person, that she loved me even if I didn't believe it. I listened once, then again, and then deleted it. Love that must be declared in defense of its own existence has already lost its pulse. I sat for a long time at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold. I wasn't sad. Sadness had been exhausted months ago. What I felt now was something closer to clarity, the emotion that comes after all others have burned themselves out. It's clean, like snow. It doesn't forgive or accuse. It just exists. 2 days later, Lucia arrived anyway. I saw her car from the window before she even knocked. I thought briefly about not opening the door, but there are some performances one must attend to close the theater properly. She stood there, her eyes swollen, her coat unbuttoned, as if she had run out of time for appearances. For a moment, seeing her like that, I felt the old ache of motherhood, how easily the body remembers to comfort even the one who wounds it. But I stayed where I was. She began talking before I could speak, about misunderstandings, about lawyers acting too quickly, about how she only wanted to ensure I'd be looked after. The phrase landed between us like a stone dropped in still water. I told her she had nothing left to look after. I was not a task. She said I was being cruel. I said I was being precise. She said she wished I could see how much she cared. I told her I did see it, and that was the problem. Her caring always came wrapped in ownership. She started to cry then, the kind of crying that comes from frustration, not grief. I let her. When she finally looked up, I said, "You don't owe me love. You owe me respect. The rest is optional." She didn't answer, just stared at me as if I'd spoken a language she didn't recognize. And maybe I had. Mothers and daughters rarely share the same tongue once power has entered the conversation. She whispered something about family, about forgiveness, but I didn't chase the words. She left soon after, slamming the car door like a period. I didn't watch her drive away. I was already elsewhere inside myself. That night, the priest called. He said Lucia had come to see him, distraught, saying I'd turned her away. I told him she was grieving something that never existed, a version of me that lived only in her sense of control. He sighed and said he understood. Then, after a pause, he asked if I'd been to the church lately. I told him no, but that I'd been praying in my kitchen, which was the truest altar I'd ever known. He chuckled softly. "Then perhaps God prefers your tea to our wine," he said. I told him that tea doesn't lie. He said he'd keep me in his prayers, and I said I didn't mind. as long as the prayer was for endurance, not forgiveness. When I hung up, I felt lighter, like something invisible had been released from my shoulders. I opened the window. The air smelled of rain and earth. The world, it seemed, had already decided to begin again. The following morning, I put on my navy coat and walked to the post office with the notary-stamped document folded neatly in my bag. On the way, I passed the bakery. The woman behind the counter saw me through the glass and waved. I waved back. It struck me then that the act of waving, of acknowledging one's own visibility, was itself a declaration of life. At the post office, I mailed copies of my signed papers to the appropriate offices. The clerk asked if I wanted to track the package. I said no. What was done did not need to be followed. As I stepped back onto the street, the sky broke open, a sudden burst of sunlight after days of gray. I stopped and tilted my face toward it. It felt like being recognized by something that owed me nothing. When I returned home, there was one final task left. I took out the box that held my husband's things, a few letters, his old watch, the photograph from our wedding. I sat on the floor and looked at the picture, at the two young people who had believed endurance was the same as love. I thought of how easily we confuse survival with devotion, how the line between them blurs until you can't tell which is which. I kissed the edge of the photograph, not out of longing but gratitude, and placed it back in the box. Then I took the wedding ring from the teacup and for the first time slid it onto my finger again. It fit differently now, looser, lighter. It was no longer a symbol of belonging, only of continuity. I walked to the garden, dug a small hollow beneath the magnolia tree, and buried the ring there. No ceremony, no prayer, just soil over metal, time over illusion. When I stood, the wind lifted the hem of my coat, and I let it. It felt like a hand, steady and approving. That night, I wrote a letter, not to Lucia, not to anyone in particular, to the world, perhaps. I wrote that I had chosen peace over permission, that I had learned silence is not weakness when it carries meaning, that dignity is a form of rebellion too quiet for applause. I signed it with my full name, Estela Rosa Gutierrez, the way the priest had said it that day, syllable by syllable, blessing by blessing. I left the letter on the kitchen table beside a candle, unlit. I didn't need light to prove the dark had ended. When I went to bed, I did not feel triumphant. Triumph is for battles. What I felt was sovereignty, a word so old it hums. I thought of the bird the boy had drawn, its wings too large for the paper, and I smiled. The world could shrink all it wanted. I would not fold again. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with the sound of pages turning. It was the sound of something being written without permission, and I understood at last. It was me. Morning came with a softness that felt almost undeserved, a pale light filtering through the curtains, like a hand that did not want to wake me, but only to touch, and for the first time in years, I woke without the brief moment of forgetting that used, to come before grief returned to its post. I lay there, listening to the faint hum of the world, the refrigerator breathing, the sparrows rehearsing their arguments in the trees, the steady rhythm of my own pulse against the pillow, and realized that the silence in the house was not emptiness, any more but room, a kind of space that belonged to me alone. I made coffee and opened the window. The air carried the smell of damp earth and something faintly metallic, the scent that comes before rain. I had no plans for the day beyond existing, which I discovered is the most ambitious plan of all when one has spent a lifetime existing for others. On the kitchen table lay the candle and the letter I had written the night before. I did not reread it. Words that are true do not require supervision. I folded it once, placed it in a drawer beside the teacup where the ring had lived, and knew I would not need to look at it again. Some closures must remain sealed to stay sacred. I put on my navy coat, the one with the deep pockets, and walked into the morning. The streets were slick from the night's drizzle, the sky low and silvery, the kind of weather that keeps people honest. At the corner, the bakery door was propped open, warm air spilling into the chill. The woman behind the counter greeted me by name and handed me a small roll wrapped in paper before I asked. "On the house," she said. "You look like someone who needs something good today." I smiled and told her I was learning that good things rarely arrive when called, so it was kind of them to find me instead. She laughed, and for a moment it felt like we had both remembered the same joke from long ago. I left with the bread still warm in my hand and walked toward the park, where the children's voices had once tangled in the air like ribbons. When I reached the community center, the door was half open. Inside, the children were seated in a circle, reading from the books we'd started weeks before. The woman who ran the program saw me and clapped her hands in delight. "Miss Estella, we thought you'd forgotten us." I told her I had been busy remembering myself instead. She grinned and told me to sit. The children shifted to make room, their small bodies warm and fidgeting, their faces bright with the uncomplicated expectation that stories would continue. I read them a tale about a tree that outlives the village that planted it, about how its roots keep reaching even when the soil changes. And when I finished, the quiet boy with the bird drawing raised his hand and asked whether the tree was lonely. I said no. It had learned that loneliness and solitude are different languages describing the same landscape, and once you understand both, you can live anywhere. He nodded solemnly, as if receiving a secret too large for his age. The children clapped, and someone handed me a paper crown made from newspaper. I wore it until they laughed themselves breathless. The crown crumpled easily, but it felt real enough to me. When the session ended, I stayed behind to tidy the tables. The room smelled of crayons and dust and the faint sweetness of childhood. On the wall, the drawing of the bird still hung in its corner, wings spread wide enough to reach the edges of the page. Beneath it, my note remained pinned, the ink slightly faded but legible. "Fly well. The sky is yours now." I added a small line beneath it with the pen I carried. "And I will be watching, not from above, but from beside." It was not sentimentality, only the truth that love need not vanish to stop demanding. I left before the next group arrived, the sound of the children's laughter following me out like music escaping through an open window. The afternoon unfolded with an unhurried grace. I stopped by the post office to collect a package I wasn't expecting. Inside was a photograph and a short note. It was from my grandson. The photo showed the two of us sitting on the park bench weeks earlier, the pastry balanced between us, both of us laughing at something invisible. The note read, "For my favorite verb." I pressed the picture against my chest and stood there until the clerk cleared his throat to remind me I was blocking the line. I thanked him, stepped aside, and laughed quietly to myself. Life, it seemed, was still capable of small conspiracies of tenderness. As evening approached, the sky deepened into a soft violet, the color of unspoken forgiveness. I walked home slowly, carrying the photograph carefully as though it were something fragile and alive. When I reached the house, the magnolia tree in the garden was shivering in the wind. A single bud had appeared, confused by the warmth of the week, and I thought of the ring sleeping in the soil beneath it. I bent down and whispered, "You're free now." Whether I meant the ring, the tree, or myself, I wasn't sure. Inside, I lit the candle I had left unlit before. The flame caught quickly, steady and quiet. I sat beside it, not to pray, but to listen. The house seemed to breathe with me. There was no bitterness left, only the faint ache of use, the way old wood hums after holding too much. I thought of Lucia then, but not with anger. I saw her as she must be at that moment, tired, perhaps softened by her own reflections, perhaps not. Either way, I no longer needed her recognition to confirm my existence. Love had become something less conditional, more diffused, like light passing through frosted glass. It reaches even where it is not aimed. I decided I would write to her eventually, not to reopen anything, but to tell her that I hoped she found her own kind of peace, and that if she ever looked for me, she would find me exactly where I had always been, in my own name, intact. The candle burned lower. Outside, the rain began again, a fine mist tapping against the window. I thought of the priest's words months ago, that some of us build the table before the feast is laid. It was true. I had built many tables in my life, for meals, for lessons, for others to stand on when they wanted to appear taller. But this silence, this evening, this steadiness, was the first table I had built for myself, and I sat at it without apology. I tore a piece of the bread from the morning, dipped it in honey, and ate slowly, a communion without witness. The taste was both ending and beginning. When the candle finally guttered out, I didn't replace it. The dark was not threatening anymore. I walked to the window, opened it, and felt the cool air spill across my face. Somewhere in the distance a train passed, its sound low and resolute, carrying other people toward other stories. I did not envy them. I had reached the quiet center of mine. The world outside was still wide, still indifferent, but no longer against me. I whispered my name once more, not to remind myself, but to savor how it felt when spoken with love. Estela Rosa Gutierrez. It hung in the air like a note that does not fade, but settles into harmony with everything around it. Tomorrow, I would wake again, bake bread, walk to the park, read to the children. Nothing miraculous, nothing theatrical, just life continuing without permission. And that, I understood at last, was the real miracle, to exist freely, to belong to oneself completely, to have survived the noise and arrived at the stillness without needing anyone to declare it victory. The wind moved through the open window and lifted the corner of the photograph on the table, the one of me and my grandson, and for a heartbeat it looked as though we were waving. I smiled and whispered to the empty room, "We're all right now." Then I closed the window and let the night take its turn, keeping watch.